May 1861. Maryland, a border state, was torn between Unionists and Southern sympathizers. Baltimore was a city in fear. Armed troops marched the streets. Telegraphs were censored. Newspapers shut down. And the city's leaders, including the grandson of the man who wrote the Star-Spangled Banner, were thrown into military prisons. The man behind this reign of terror was Abraham Lincoln. He knew that if Maryland joined the Confederacy, Washington, D.C. would be cut off from the North. He would do anything necessary to stop it.
One of Lincoln's most important contributions to the presidency, if not the most important, is the development of a war powers notion of the presidency.
He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, so he's trying to isolate and quarantine the die-hard rebels from all their sources of support and smother the rebellion.
Ever since hostilities had begun a month earlier, the president had been vigorously exercising his role as commander-in-chief.
After Fort Sumter, Lincoln took on the first of his series of extraordinary executive powers. He called up the militia, he called for 75,000 troops, and he imposed a blockade on southern ports. And he did all of the above without the consent of Congress, which was in recess. Unheard of.
His strong-arm tactics prevented leaders in Maryland from voting to join the 11 states of the Confederacy in September of 1861. But some felt he had jeopardized the Constitution.
He's condemned for suspending the writ of habeas corpus. The Constitution says that one of the 2 times you can suspend the writ of habeas corpus is during a rebellion.
The Supreme Court demands that the federal government produce a writ of habeas corpus, and Abraham Lincoln just ignores the Chief Justice of the United States. It was very daring and very politically astute.
The court was not the only branch of government that fell under the sway of the man in the executive office. Congress, now representing only pro-union states, passed bills that retroactively supported military actions like the blockade of the South that Lincoln had taken months earlier.
Lincoln embodies the term commander-in-chief, even though he had less military experience and knowledge than just about anybody who's ever had to practically use that role. He came to it with the briefest of experiences in uniform, a member of a volunteer company in an Indian war in the 1830s.
When Lincoln becomes president, he really knows next to nothing about military affairs. And suddenly he has to sketch out, he has to respond to a number of crises that force him to define, to articulate this commander-in-chief job.
We don't realize that he was the one who really learned how to use the telegraph in real time, communicating with his field officers. He knew what was going on. It changed the whole way the president would be an active participant in a war.
Lincoln was so consumed with his responsibility for the nation that when his son Willie died from typhoid fever, it barely seemed to register. Where one of his predecessors, Franklin Pierce, had been broken by tragedy, Lincoln appeared unaffected.
You would not have known from Lincoln's day-to-day conduct of business in the White House in February and March of 1862 that anything in the nature of a personal crisis had happened to him. But privately, Lincoln was crushed by the death of Willie.
Lincoln worked ceaselessly and could often be found pacing the halls of the White House well after midnight, but he found little impediment from Congress. With the southern states out, there was little opposition, which helped him accomplish a wide-ranging domestic agenda at the same time he was conducting a war.
The Homestead Act opens up the Midwest to settlement. The Land Grant College Act introduces a public component to higher education for the first time. The Pacific Railway Act provides the infrastructure for the Transcontinental Railroad. So all these things happen in the 37th Congress. It's a very active Congress.
But perhaps Lincoln's most profound achievement and his greatest legacy was the Emancipation Proclamation.
One of Lincoln's greatest attributes was his sense of timing. With slavery, he hesitated because he wanted to keep the support of people who had different kinds of feelings about slavery. So he hesitated to free the slaves.
But just like any smart person, he reads more, he learns more, he's open-minded, and he realizes the time has come to end slavery. He changes his mind.
And in some measure, Lincoln encapsulates what happened to the country. Lincoln believed that slavery was wrong, he said, his entire adult life. And many, many people grappled with that as a moral issue.
Knowing how sensitive the topic was, he didn't risk any wrangling in Congress. Once again, Lincoln acted unilaterally.
When he issues the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, he doesn't actually have any civil authority to emancipate slaves as president, but he does, or at least claims, authority to do so as commander-in-chief, as a wartime necessity.
People say now it had no effect. I don't agree. For the next year and a half, or 2 years, whenever a Union army advanced in the Confederate South, slaves were freed in their way.
But as Lincoln freed the slaves, the Northern war effort was floundering. With Union casualties at nearly 100,000, Lincoln was in desperate need of better military leaders.
The biggest challenge that Lincoln faced with generals is that they lost when they should have won. I mean, Lincoln really thought this would be a 90-day war, so Lincoln had to look for fresh blood.
Lincoln removed General George McClellan, and as he struggled to find an adequate replacement over the coming months, an emboldened Robert E. Lee, the head Southern general, decided to invade the North. The place? Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. His miscalculation resulted in the worst defeat for the South since the war began. 28,000 casualties in 3 days. The words Lincoln wrote in the aftermath of that Northern victory made the Battle of Gettysburg immortal.
In addition to his political achievements, he's the greatest presidential writer and possibly the greatest writer in American history.
The whole Gettysburg Address is some 250 words. It takes 3 minutes to read. Lincoln understood the value of getting your message out in a very few words.
The Gettysburg Address was the poetic accompaniment that committed the country to improving itself, to completing unfinished work, based on the sacrifices of those who were fighting to restore the American democracy.
Gettysburg was a turning point, not only the beginning of the end for the South, but as a stage where Lincoln presented a new vision of the federal government as the defender of liberty for all. In 1864, the Civil War entered its fourth blood-drenched year. Lincoln's new top general was Ulysses S. Grant, nicknamed the Butcher because of his dogged pursuit of the enemy at a tremendous cost to his own men. The wartime president's popularity ebbed. In the election that year, he ran against a bitter enemy, George McClellan, the general he had fired 2 years before, and who now promised to end the war immediately.
In the middle of a war, it would not have been unthinkable for Lincoln to say, okay, we're simply going to postpone the election. But he resisted the temptation because he believed that things that makes democracy work is that we hold elections, even when the elections are difficult.
Lincoln could now make the argument that it would be unwise to change horses midstream, the horse being Lincoln and the stream, the Civil War itself.
Lincoln had this idea of rechristening the Republican Party as the Union Party. He wants the emblem of a unified single party. He sent his vice president packing and allowed the convention to choose a Democrat as his running mate, to give substance to the idea of a Union Party coalition. And that was Andrew Johnson of Tennessee.
So, election of 1864, Lincoln wins, but Lincoln wins no larger a percentage of the vote in the North in 1864 than he had in 1860. After all those incredible accomplishments, after the Gettysburg Address, after the Emancipation Proclamation, over 40% of white Northerners say no. So I think there's an important lesson is that we look back on these presidents and they weren't always monuments.
Over the next 5 months, the war drew to a close. Starved, outmanned, and outgunned, the South fell. The Treaty of Surrender would eventually be signed by Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. As the war was still concluding, Lincoln held his second inaugural.
The amazing thing about Lincoln's second inaugural is that it was not celebratory. It was not a victory statement. He stood up there and delivered a lecture in which he said, we're all equally responsible for this mortal sin that we allowed to fester in our country for hundreds of years.
But there was also another issue. What was going to happen? There were 400,000 African Americans in the United States at the time of the founding. At the time of the Civil War, it had grown to 4 million. By that time, for any objective observer, it was clear that these people were going to have many of the rights that whites would have.
For an angry young Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth, the end of slavery and Lincoln's victory were unacceptable.
He not only attends the inauguration, he's actually in the rotunda of the Capitol earlier when Lincoln walks through, and more than one observer sees him glaring at Abraham Lincoln, almost threateningly, and more than one person says, this guy has to be watched.
April 14th, 1865. A shot rang out in Ford's Theater. The president slumped forward. By sunrise the next day, Abraham Lincoln was dead, and the final chapter of the Civil War, the reconstruction of a nation, would be written without him.
I mean, it's hard to imagine. I mean, here's a country that has just gone through perpetual crisis and loss. The country lost the equivalent of today of 6 million people over the preceding 4 years. And now you have the president who has seen you through all of that, senselessly gunned down.
Lincoln would be remembered for many things, but he was also now the first president in U.S. history to be assassinated. And while he clearly envisioned mercy for the South, he left behind no detailed roadmap for the nation's reunification.
Lincoln had a plan for Reconstruction, but he didn't get a chance to carry any of it out. All of it is very speculative.
President Lincoln and Franklin Delano Roosevelt share one grave shortcoming. They thought they were immortal, and they did not prepare their vice presidents to take over. Harry Truman knew very little when he came into office because FDR didn't confide in him. And Andrew Johnson came into the presidency completely unprepared in terms of knowing where the administration was and what it was planning to do.
Without a hint at what Lincoln's plans for reconstructing America would be, the country was left in shock as the virtual unknown vice president, Andrew Johnson, assumed power. But one thing was certain. His imprint on the presidency was solidified.
The winning of that war was such a big political achievement that he had to really rewire the system. And he became a far more important president than any president before him, probably including Washington, who was his hero.
Lincoln changed the office forever. He showed that one person could meet the emergency by using emergency powers. Democrats, Republicans are doing what Lincoln did, whether it's Franklin D. Roosevelt and rallying the country for the New Deal, Richard Nixon sending more troops to Vietnam.
With Abraham Lincoln, there's a general impression that only when he was killed did people appreciate what they had had among them. But in fact, publications like Harper's Weekly, which was probably the most popular periodical in the northern part of the United States during the Civil War, said that he would go down in history as the greatest president the United States had ever had.